Boa tarde, pessoal. Voltamos, estamos mais uma vez ao vivo para a nossa segunda palestra do dia. Espero que estejam todos aí. Vamos dar prosseguimento ao 5º Seminário de Estudos do Gótico e ao 24º Seminário do Programa de Pós-graduação em Estudos Literários. Agora, então, com a nossa palestra de abertura oficial do evento, que está sendo trazida aqui para nós pelo nosso convidado internacional, o professor Xavier Aldana Reyes, da Manchester Metropolitan University, no Reino Unido, que muito gentilmente aceitou o nosso convite para fazer essa fala de abertura oficial do evento. Ele vai nos trazer hoje uma palestra sobre Contemporary Body Horror, o horror corporal contemporâneo. A palestra será em inglês. Vocês podem interagir em português ou em inglês aqui nos comentários. Ao final da fala do professor, se houver perguntas, comentários que estejam em português, eu vou traduzir para o inglês para ele, tá bem? Então, fiquem tranquilos e tranquilas em relação a isso, tá bem? Eu vou apresentar o professor em português e vou apresentá-lo em inglês também, e quando eu apresentá-lo em inglês, eu vou imediatamente passar a palavra para ele e ele começa a sua fala, ok? Então, professor Xavier Aldana Reyes é um reader de literatura inglesa e cinema na Manchester Metropolitan University, na Inglaterra, e é um dos membros fundadores do Centro de Estudos do Gótico da Universidade de Manchester. Ele trabalha atualmente, né, com a literatura contemporânea e moderna, cinema e televisão, do começo do século XX até os dias atuais. Dr. Aldana Reyes é especialista em gótico, em filme e ficção, gótica e de horror, em suas histórias, na indústria e no seu papel sociopolítico, né? Papel sociopolítico aí do gótico e do horror. O foco das pesquisas acadêmicas do professor Aldana Reyes recai, né, no papel da corporalidade, da corporificação na literatura e no cinema, né, na relação entre estética e afeto, e na natureza transnacional dos modos e gêneros, né? E na habilidade do horror de mediar os traumas pessoais e nacionais, não é? O professor Aldana Reyes tem publicado muitos livros e artigos sobre esses assuntos, e ao final deste próximo mês de novembro, agora de 2024, nós vamos ter, né, assim esperamos, né, a publicação do seu mais novo livro, o Contemporary Body Horror, a ser publicado pela Cambridge University Press. Então, a palestra do professor hoje é uma palestra que está relacionada a essa nova publicação dele, a publicação que está para ser realizada, né? Então, somos muito gratos e felizes por ele trazer algo tão contemporâneo e tão, assim, praticamente saído do forno, não é? Bom, feita a apresentação em português, agora eu vou fazer a apresentação em inglês. So, thank you, Javi, for being with us now officially, okay? I've done your introduction in Portuguese, now you do the same in English, and then the word is yours, okay? So, Dr. Javier Aldana Reyes is a reader in English literature and film at Manchester Metropolitan University, England, and the founding member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. He works across modern and contemporary literature, cinema and television, from the early 20th century to the present day. Dr. Aldana Reyes specializes in Gothic and horror film and fiction, their histories, industries, and social-political work. His academic research focuses on the role of corporeality and embodiment in literature and cinema, the relationship between aesthetics and effect, the transnational nature of modes and genres, and the ability of horror to mediate personal and national trauma. Dr. Aldana Reyes has been publishing many books and articles on these subjects, and by the end of this November, we will have his brand new book, Contemporary Body Horror, to be published by Cambridge University Press. So, thank you again, Professor Aldana Reyes. The word is yours. So, thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you so much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be part of this 5th seminar of Gothic Studies here in Brazil. I was actually supposed to visit Brazil in 2020, and then the pandemic happened. So who knows? Hopefully one day I'll be able to make good my promise of actually physically being there. But I'm very excited about all the interest in the Gothic that's emerging from Brazil, and it's hugely exciting to be a part of this 5th seminar. So thank you so much for having me. And you've done a very, very good job of introducing me, so I don't really feel the need to do it again. I can't always rely on that. So I just wanted to, for anyone who hasn't met me before or who doesn't know who I am, I just wanted to give you a couple of pointers of the kind of work that I do. As Cido has explained, I work primarily in literature and cinema. My BA and my MA were in literature, but I did my PhD in film, and I've ended up working across cinema and literature, sometimes with a dashing of streaming TV, but mostly I write about literature, about novels and short fiction, like short stories, and cinema. That tends to be what I focus on. Corporeality is something that I keep going back to. I'll talk about this more in a second. And I've been lucky enough to get to work with people like the British Library and increasingly with film distributors to try and make some of this Gothic and horror texts available to a wider audience, and to sort of bring things from the university, from the ivory tower of the university, to a wider audience. So I've done things like acted as fiction anthologist and done really strange things I never thought I would do with my life, like do audio commentaries for films. That's all been really quite exciting. I'll say a bit more about where this project that I'm going to talk about today is coming from. But first, I just wanted to do a very quick shout out to the Gothic Centre, the place where I come from, so to speak, and that helped me cement a lot of my understanding around the Gothic mode and the horror genre more generally. We were founded in 2013, and we have continued to work with a wider audience, doing things like events, public festivals in the city of Manchester, working with people like the BFI, for example, done things in the John Rylands Library, one of the main cultural centres for the city. And we've managed to host the International Gothic Association in 2018. For those of you who are not familiar with the International Gothic Association, it is the biggest association for Gothic scholars in the world, and it's most definitely open to you as well. It accepts members from all over the world, and to join is actually quite cheap. I think it's under £10 at the moment. The next IGA, we tend to have conferences every couple of years, will be in Hull in England in 2026. So hopefully we might see some of you there. And since 2018 and since the pandemic, we have tried to do a few more things online. We did a couple of series of online papers that you can find on our YouTube channel for the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. And we've done a couple of summer schools in the months of June of the last couple of years. And we're planning our first conference in person for next summer. That will be the first conference we run proper conference since 2018. So we're very excited about doing that. And who knows, we might be able to welcome some of you there in person as well. And before I get going as well, just a couple of things. I normally distinguish between the Gothic mode as an aesthetic mode and horror as a genre premised on emotion. For the purposes of this talk in particular, I'm not going to be distinguishing between the two specifically, but the talk is kind of more generally concerned with the horror genre as a whole, rather than with Gothic horror as a specific strand of horror cinema, right? And literature, because I'm talking about novels as well. I just wanted to make that clear because there's a certain slipperiness about that term sometimes in conferences and so on. So today's talk is largely about horror, but many of the things I'll be saying probably apply to the Gothic mode more generally. And again, just a quick preliminary on what took me back to body horror. I published my first book in 2014, Body Gothic, which I wrote largely during my PhD, and then during 2012 and 2013 primarily got published in 2014. And although I stand by everything that I said in this book, and I agree with myself still, that doesn't always happen. My thinking around that book has kind of haunted me in a very kind of Gothic way, in that I published the book in 2014, which is normally now identified as the beginning for a new wave of body horror. It's also identified as the beginning of so-called elevated horror, or more avant-garde experimental horror that we've seen since. So when I wrote this book, I wrote it before this fantastic wave of filmmaking and publishing had happened. And I noticed that people were starting to sort of go back to it to try and explain things like films like Raw, for example, or other body horrors that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years. And it always pained me that I never had managed to talk about those texts myself. I think I ended that book with American Mary, which was way before 2014. So I started thinking about writing an afterword to this book that would look at the last 10 years and sort of update the book. But as tends to happen with anything I do, it grew and grew and grew, and eventually it became its own thing. So when the opportunity came up to write a short book, this book is around 35,000 words, I jumped at it because it was such a great opportunity to be able to update my theory. And I've ended up with an entirely different book. They're obviously intrinsically connected, they're mother and daughter, but they're talking about very different periods in time. So I think of it as a very distinct and unique project. I guess one way or another, I've been writing about the body for quite a long time now. But I hadn't returned to it properly in book format. So I can also tell you it won't be the last book I write about body horror. I've started another one for the shortcut series, where I'm going to be talking very specifically about the cultural work that body horror does. So I like to think of contemporary body horror, which is the basis for the talk that I'm going to be giving in a second, as sort of the beginning of this new chapter that I'm writing as we speak. So that's the context. That's how we go from body gothic in 2014 to contemporary body horror in 2024. I wanted to address everything that's happened in the last 10 years, and I wanted to look at this different type of body horror that is emerging from very different filmmakers and writers than we've seen before. Right, so I'll get started. And this is a talk on body horror, so I feel like to give you a trigger warning is a bit pointless, and I have tried wherever possible to keep the presentation as PG-13 as possible, because I don't intend to harm anyone's sensibility. But body horror is by nature quite an icky genre, so although I haven't chosen images that are particularly out there, everyone's got personal thresholds for topics. I will be talking about things like sexual harassment. So, if those topics and if body horror as a whole is not something you want to engage with, then hopefully you're not in the room as we speak. But this is your warning that I'm going to be covering these topics. Right. So, as I said, what you're going to hear now is extracted from the book that should be out in November this year, hopefully. So, body horror, loosely defined as a subgenre of horror concerned with the maiming, destruction, transformation, or grotesque exaggeration of the human body, is not a recent phenomenon. Despite the popular association of body horror with the 1980s, a period that did, in fact, coin the term and produce the first influential theorization of spectacular corporeality in the horror film, the primary concerns of this subgenre can be traced much further back. First wave Gothic novels and fin de siècle canonical texts, especially Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Robert Marsh's The Beetle, already delved into many of the concerns that would become the main province of body horror. These being physical difference as a source of abjection, anxieties about contagion and degeneration, and the loss of a stable sense of human identity, and thereby turned the body and mind into concerted loci of fear. And before the narrative techniques of what would come to be marketed as horror in the 20th century began to be formalized in the shape of the Gothic romance and the 19th century penny dreadful, a discourse of exceptionality and caution had surrounded accounts of monsters and mythical beasts in ancient classical literature and poetry. It is therefore plausible, I think, to conceive of the intricacies of body horror as universal, if simultaneously time-sensitive and culturally bound anxieties, anxieties that permeate the art of terror for entertainment more generally. Worries over beauty, over body shape, and myriads of other corporeal markers that affect human relationships and underpin economic, medical, linguistic, and judicial exchanges exist across countries and continents, and prejudices such as ageism, disableism, racism, or misogyny are sadly still largely widespread. Now, there are good reasons why body horror is linked in the popular imagination with the late 20th century, though. Some of its best known examples were released or published between the end of the 1970s and the early 1990s. And I wanted to give you now, it's going to sound like a really long list of films and novels, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the true scope of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, well, end of the 70s to beginning of the 90s. So I do apologize for the long list of text that I'm about to read out to you, but it will come to an end soon. So we've got the earlier work of David Cronenberg, especially Shivers from 1975, Rabbit 1977, The Brood 1979, Scanners 1981, Videodrome 1983, The Fly 1986, Undead Ringers from 1988. We've got Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979 and The Art of H.R. Geiger, Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead from 1981 and Evil Dead 2 from 1987, John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, Frank Henenlotter's Basket Case from 1982, Brain Damage from 1988, Basket Case 2 from 1990, and Frankenhooker from 1990. Ken Russell's Altered States from 1980, Larry Cohen's The Stuff from 1985, Peter Jackson's Bad Taste from 1987 and Braindead from 1992, Stuart Gordon's Reanimator from 1985 and From Beyond 1986, which were followed by Brian Usner's Society from 1989 and Bride of Reanimator from 1990, J. Michael Muro's Street Trash from 1987, Clive Barker's Hellraiser 1987, as well as the movement that they were seen to engender, including fiction by David J. Shaw, John Skipp and Craig Spector, Joe R. Lansdale and Sean Hudson, among others. We've also got Japanese cyberpunk classics like Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira from 1988, or Shinya Tsukamoto's Tetsuo the Iron Man from 1989, and Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer from 1992, and Shozin Fukui's 964 Pinocchio from 1991. Even gore films like Hisayasu Sato's Naked Blood from 1996 and Kei Fujiwara's Organ from 1996. As this by no means exhaustive, there could have been more examples, shows, body horror was predominantly a visual artistic subgenre. Even though novels like Robin Cook Coma from 1977, Angela Carter's The Passion of New Eve, also from 77, and The Bloody Chamber from 1979, Ian Banks's The Wasp Factory from 1984, and Catherine Dunn's Geek Love from 1989, as well as Dennis Cooper's Frisk from 1991, and Poppy Z. Bright's Exquisite Corpse from 1996, trod very similar ground. The rise of body horror fiction must also be understood within the market context of the horror paperback boom that peaked in the 1980s, which saw novels such as James Herbert's The Rats from 1974 and The Fog, 75, or Gregory A. Douglas's The Nest from 1980, to name only three, resort to gross, anatomically detailed displays of violence that mirrored the rise of cheap kills in slasher films. Apologies, it's 7 p.m. here and I've spent all day teaching, so I'm running out of voice. As I have argued elsewhere, all horror could be said to be biological, at least to some degree, because it seeks to elicit pleasurable negative emotions on viewers or readers. That is to say, that it is entertainment that evokes dread, suspense, or shock, states of mind and body that humans shun in real life due to their possible detrimental effects. Such a statement, quite a basic one, is concerned with the rudimentary operations of the horror experience rather than with thematics of given texts, which might be subdivided according to unique patterns and subgenres, and so eco-horror, folk horror, body horror. Body horror, though, is biological in a much more self-evident manner. It deals straightforwardly and narratively with human biology. Which is not to say that it is exclusively interested in the so-called natural body. The main propositions I put forward in the book that I've been telling you about, and therefore in this presentation as well, are as follows. And I think this is the only bit of writing in the entire presentation. Yeah, enjoy it. My theses are: one, that body horror is a recurring relational subgenre that evolves alongside and in response to ever-changing corporeal norms and directives, making visible normalized processes of biopolitical surveillance and regulation, and thus calling attention to corporeal privileges and social injustices. Two, that body horror locates fear within the body, not just its vulnerability to attack and to harm, as most horror does, but also our sense of subjective unity, identity, and civil rights. Three, that the type of peril body horror characters face is one that leads to a process of objectification or dehumanization of the person, or else a dissipation and even loss of the self. And finally, four, that contemporary body horror increasingly includes a reconstitutive phase that is ethically underpinned and revelatory, sometimes organized around the integration of the other into the self, or of the individual subject into a community. I don't really have time to go into the community aspect today, but that's something that I explore in the book as well, especially in relation to Black horror. But I'll be talking definitely about otherness and incorporation of otherness. So having said all this, of course, body horror carries the corporeal in its very name. So I think it's important that we start with biology. In his excellent essay, An Assessment of Body Horror's Physiological Underpinnings, biologist Ronald Allen Lopez Cruz surveyed the core human anxieties that find a voice in the subgenres manipulation and warping of the normal state of bodily form and function. These are his words. Or, quote, the way it goes against what is considered normal anatomy and function in biological species, not limited to humans. So, monstrous hybrids, mutations and diseases that are manifested as physical and behavioral deterioration, metamorphosis, and zombification, end quote. Hybridity is frightening, not only because it bulldozes taxonomic exactitude, but because in the animal world, species are defined by interbreeding and the procreative passing on of genes. Individuals from different species are typically prevented from mating by their physical disposition because the process would lead to infertile or evolutionary dead ends. Categorical confusion is also advocated by metamorphosis, which in the natural world is adaptive, insofar as it affords more varied food resources and removes competition for them between youngsters and adults in any given species. In body horror, these metamorphoses are rarely pragmatic or strictly beneficial, something that distinguishes them from transformations in the fantasy genre or in mythical texts, where, you might grow wings and fly, and that's a very good thing. Growing wings in The Fly, not so good. So likewise, mutations, although necessary for evolutionary purposes, can be the source of bodily and psychological disorders, affecting, for example, symmetry, which is an indicator of health and a prized characteristic in the animal kingdom, and can lead to, quote, this is Alan Lopez Cruz as well, to severe physical and behavioral aberrations, end quote. In body horror, our usually stable cellular footing is thrown into turmoil. Anatomies become flexible, permeable, and in flux, and therefore become unreliable, prone to growing impossible, dangerous, or impractical limbs, and organs that confuse and pollute species purity. All of our lives involve a sizable number of exercises designed to keep our body in check, from the identification of threatening conditions around us to the treatment of disease and the maintenance of enough cleanliness to prevent ailments. Much of body horror therefore relishes the sick body and its connotations with deterioration and death, and in some cases contagion, as is evident from even just the most passing look at body horrors of the last 10 years, and beyond that, things like Cabin Fever from 2002, Thanatomorphose from 2012. Now, this is not a film I recommend to anyone that doesn't have a strong stomach. You have been warned. Or films like Contracted from 2013, also not for the faint of heart, and a film like The Beach House from 2019. The issue of contagion is not going away, and if anything, has been made increasingly more significant and important thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the zombie, as a literal walking corpse, represents the utmost in abjection, as we know from Julia Kristeva, signifying the final disintegration of the flesh, the process whereby the living organism becomes waste. Put simply, body horror is biology run amok, messy corporeality that refuses to be boxed in or contained in any way. The return of the embarrassing, disobedient, or unsocialized, maybe even unsociable body. Categorical transgressions of bodily signification are inherent to the ingrained unruliness of body horror. In modern horror, the distance between hero and monster, between self and other, between the external and the internal, all but disappears. As Andrew Tudor remarked of films like Alien, The Exorcist, Rabbit, and Videodrome, all of them pictured in this slide for you, traditional sex boundaries are combined in these films into a threatening composite in the bodies of their protagonists, an act that necessarily undermines their supposed natural limits. This is his argument. I would add that such bodies are also fascinating, deeply fascinating to us as audiences. So Kane's incubation and birthing of the chestburster is absolutely fascinating the first time you watch it. Reagan's androgynous appearance is also fascinating. Rose's empowering armpit phallus, Max's abdominal gash, in fact, everything about Videodrome. These bodies prompt an interrogation of the identities defined by the markers that they deliberately trouble and repurpose. It could be countered, of course, that the liberating elements of such texts are short-lived and even doomed to fail, as in many cases the strange conversions, hybridizations, and transfigurations are lethal to intradiegetic characters. But this does not mean that their propositions need to be conceived as detrimental, less innovative, or even unenjoyable. Besides, body horror texts tend to create sympathy for their protagonists and resist endings that merely return us to a cleansed version of the status quo. Body horror is a lot messier. It doesn't really have neat, happy endings. If threatening agents are destroyed, the possibility of their return is always imminent, and their sullying of corporeal integrity is hard to shake off completely. The othering of body horror does not operate, therefore, as a reifying conservative defilement right, but as a spanner in the works of assumptions about biology, and especially its accretions of cultural meaning. And this is at least, the point I'm making in the book. So, another way of putting this is that when body horror presents us with corporeal doubt, its questioning extends to the body politic as well as the corporeal or biological body. After all, as Mary Douglas, after Marcel Mauss, proposed, the human body is always treated as an image of society. These are her words. And, quote, there can be no natural way of considering the body that does not involve at the same time a social dimension. Bodies exist within society, in other words. So while Andrew Tudor in the 1990s read these challenges to religion, to political organizations, to science, to commercial corporations, and to the police as an indication that, quote, formerly authoritative institutions no longer command respect for individuals whose contemporary social lives were marked by disorder and incoherence, the view from the 2020s reveals that body horror is, and perhaps always has been, skeptical of monolithic views on the body. Indeed, body horror shows how the body has always operated as a readable text, and a text under public scrutiny at that, and also enforced inscription, and how subjectivity is the result of processes of legibility and knowability. Embodiment and desire are enmeshed within and produced by representational, symbolic, and linguistic systems that are themselves shaped by histories of power and their resulting inequalities, as well as as well as the medical and juridical categories used to understand and differentiate people psychologically and physically. Just as biology only accounts for some aspects of embodiment, then, the body is now theorized as a discursive composite, a point of convergence for various forms of experience and socio-political projection. In short, I think it's a lot more than just biology. I think it's society, it's politics, it's the messages in the films as well that matter. So, one strand of contemporary body horror has concerned itself with the necropolitical exchanges that reduce the human body to an object, typically of punishment or of play, in franchises like Saw, the Saw films, or the Hostel films, but also sometimes as an exclusive good in cannibal fictions, which have used this trope, the trope of cannibalism, to explore anything from the cruel brutality of factory farming to the social pressures from which women suffer. And I know that some people wouldn't choose to look at cannibal films as body horror, but that's part of my argument. I think that they involve a transformation from human to object. And normally they are very gory and quite visceral, that I think makes them body horror for me as well. So I'll be looking at these body horrors first, and then the more transformative body horrors, which are the more canonical body horrors. And that's also how I divide the book as well. Half of it is those kind of necropolitical body horrors. The other half is the more metamorphic ones. So in films like What You Wish For, directed by Nicholas Tumney and released in 2023, this film is set in a Latin American rainforest where the produce happens to be down on their luck locals, people who the film supposes won't be much missed by their communities, but will be definitely appreciated by the customers, who are a jet-setting elite. You can see them there at the bottom on the right, who have an appetite for human meat. And this appetite is naturally the prerogative of the corporate cannibal, the archetype of the high-end urbanite who is embedded in big business and obsessed by brands and competitive success. You know, we know this character very well from Bret Easton Ellis's novel American Psycho from 1991. They are the Patrick Batemans of the world. And in that picture there at the bottom, they're waiting for their meal, as I said, made out of local produce. And the thing that they love the most is tongue sashimi, because it's something that no one else can have. The dog-eat-dog ethos and survival of the fittest logic, whereby the privileged get to buy or prey upon the disadvantaged, which are often the destitute, sex workers, or else those who are unable to contribute their labor to society, is metaphorized in dystopias like Don LePan's Animals, his novel from 2009, where so-called mongrels, or humans born with disabilities caused by pollution, are deemed less than human, first by public perception and subsequently by the courts. And of course, that means that they can then be eaten with impunity. It's no longer a crime to eat that particular type of person. And this is not the only text to look at this potential dystopia in which people are either forced or choose to eat other people as a means of sustenance. So the disenfranchised are also big game in fictions that descend from Richard Connor's short story, The Most Dangerous Game, the short story from 1924, which was made into the film in a film in 1932, I think. The gamification of murder in films like Escape Room from 2019, or The Hunt from 2020, or maybe the BBC series Wreck with a W from 2022, is supported by the de facto maxim that some humans, and that's always the poorest humans, are less worthy than others. The ongoing Purge franchise, in which murder is decriminalized for 12 hours a year, already pointed to how such visions of social Darwinism build on existing systems of exclusion that disproportionately affect ethnic minorities and people in precarious financial positions. Netflix series such as Squid Game is only the most successful in a long chain of such representations that also includes the Hunger Games, the franchise, and the Battle Royale franchise as well. Capitalism, and often explicitly its colonial foundations and neoliberal legacies, is always the oppressive system that facilitates the birth of these body horrors. And as I said before, these might be horrors that get called something different by different people. They might be called political horror. Something like the first Purge is also potentially black horror to some level. I choose to read them as body horror because to me they are about the reduction of the person to an object, or in this case is to a pawn in a game, in somebody else's game. Body horror engages more than a critique of existing structures of power and order. It can also stimulate fictional journeys for both characters and viewers or readers. And these journeys are between the self and the other, effectively confusing, blurring, and merging these concepts, and often erecting a new palimpsest altogether. While earlier body horror presented transformed bodies with an initial excitement, ultimately undercut by caution or fear, contemporary horror is a bit more interested in the liberatory and speculative possibilities of the shared kinship that's intrinsic to symbiotic bonds. Body horror is perhaps less visionary and less optimistic about the overall ability of its mutants to exist in the current world to which they pose a threat than maybe other genres like science fiction, for example. But in epitomizing this opposition, body horror does not reestablish binaries, but rather questions the constructed barriers between healthy, acceptable and valuable bodies and their objected counterparts, including the discriminatory rhetoric used in social processes of subjection and systemic inequality. It applies pressure on the constructed nature of the normative body and centers awakenings provided by the moral and psychological changes that accompany physical alterations. It turns horror's critical eye inwards and asks viewers to parse their own engagement with and involvement in processes of differentiation. It is perhaps a truism that our sense of self is elaborated through comparison and through distancing ourselves from that which we recognize as different due to contrasting values, aesthetics, or any other form of subjective parameter. Metamorphic body horror, as I'm calling it in this book, proposes a state of vacillation between the self and the other that advocates for the upholding of a third self-other in many cases, echoing post-millennial trends like the rise of the sympathetic monster in the works of Tim Burton, Guillermo del Toro, and Stephanie Meyer, among others. The incorporation of the other, oftentimes of a feared nightmare, can lead to self-understanding and personal growth in an echo of the non-human becomings that post-structuralist philosophers like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari theorized as reciprocal zones of creation as well as collective action. In short, body horror can, and I think does, enable forms of rewriting and ideological resistance. The biological and metamorphic constants that eventually granted body horror the status of distinct subgenre have logically tended to dominate discussions of its value and remit, as well as guided the direction of research into its main artistic exponents. Without seeking to underplay the crucial and very timely debates that body horror has contributed to and continues to reflect, one of my aims is to extend the general meaning of the term body horror to avoid a potential cul-de-sac, its reduction to a distorting mirror of society, or even worse, an irrelevant and démodé carnivalesque attraction. I think it's a lot more than that. Much body horror has transformative potential, is what I argue. It can actively encourage empathy for others and change in oneself. My contention is that the scope of what body horror designates must be broadened to encompass new contemporary manifestations that, due to their allegiance to other subgeneric or thematic strands, may not be readily associated with the body horror rubric. So I've looked at the examples of cannibal fictions, for example. Such as feminist horror as well, which I look at in the book, or some strands of queer body horror and black horror. Or rather, some people would call it queer horror alone. I think there's a substrand of queer body horror that's really significant and important. Utilizing the vocabulary and the tools of body horror can open up new avenues of thought that complement and enhance feminist, sexually unprejudiced, trans-inclusive, and anti-racist approaches. Body horror is implicitly and sometimes even explicitly underpinned by critical interventions in body studies, which comprise research into how biopower molds perceptions of gender, race, age, class, beauty, and illness, and how corporeality is invested with significance more generally. Our conception of body horror must grow to embrace the concerns of the subgenre in its present status as it builds on its history to capture new, timely socio-political debates. And I think this issue of body horror knowing what it's doing, it's important. I've got an example of The Substance, which came out very recently, at least here in the UK. And that's a film that really knows its body horror references. I mean, the director has spoken openly about the influence of David Cronenberg on her feminist work. So, my theory of body horror in this book introduces an element of importance to its contemporary reframing. The source of threat that typically defines horror as a genre, although sometimes initially external or parasitic, eventually manifests within, transforming the essence of the self and or fundamentally disrupting its integrity. Contemporary body horror, I argue, needs to be re-envisioned as genuinely committed to portraying social injustices because it both creates a strong alliance between literal intradiegetic victim and the experience of discrimination, and because it grounds that tension in the self. Body horror's typical movements between the self and the other, at times leading to the incorporation of one into the other or even to a dissolution between them, creates a fictional engagement between objected other and ostensible normal self that reveals the arbitrary construction of the normative body. In turning our bodies into extraneous, ungovernable forces, we're not just confronted with radical difference, but encouraged to understand it as a fundamental part of ourselves, to accept and even to assimilate it. Horror theorist Adam Lowenstein writes of how modern horror's minority vocabulary, these are his words, takes exception to the presumptions that the genre, quote, thrives negatively on otherness, and that texts in the 21st century have helped acknowledge actual minority experience as real pain rather than just as paranoid fantasy, end quote. Transcending the discourse upon which othering is based requires us to contemplate the fact that we too are capable of monstrous behavior. Body horror takes one step further by proposing that this state of affairs is not exceptional, but actually a part of everyday life and even constitutive of subjectivity. That is, we routinely act with prejudice. Such a statement is not tantamount to suggesting that we are intrinsically horrible people, but rather a reminder that monstrosity is always an acquired trait rather than something inherent. To a greater extent than ever before, contemporary texts configure monstrosity as a moral or an ethical flaw. Normally one profit by greed, by lack of compassion, or by selfishness, and they spurn the ableist, spectacular discourse that once equated evil with physical grotesqueries and with neurodiversity. This reframing of exceptional bodies, habitually the main selling point of the horror film, riffs off concurrent developments in cinema, such as the wave of new horror films in the 2010s and 2020s that privileged art house techniques, slower paces, and psychological tableau derived from the melodrama. This cinema has sometimes been called elevated horror. I'm not a huge fan of this label because I think a lot of horror is elevated or whatever. I don't think that it's exclusive to this particular phase in horror, but I do agree that it is uniquely interested in deploying horror differently. So, films like The Orphanage from 2007, The Babadook from 2014, or The Nightingale from 2018, Hereditary from 2018, Midsommar from 2019, Saint Maud from 2019, Relic from 2020, Censor from 2021, Men from 2022, Smile also from 2022, and Talk to Me also 2022, and this is only to name perhaps some of the most well-known examples, have centered trauma and grief as major catalysts of the horror experience. Negative emotions in these films are corporeally and psychologically inscribed, with traditional external monsters morphing into intrusive internal hallucinations and hauntings migrating from mansions and terrible places into the minds of the protagonists. In contemporary horror, the threat is personal and latent, even when the damage is generated by the actions of others. Body horror has adopted this language, the language and discourse of trauma, and displays the correspondence between mind and body that it takes as a given, going as far as to propose that physical alterations, which are a correlate of underlying mental processes in these films, are not just transformative, but sometimes terminal. In films like Black Swan, Black Swan is from 2011, Raw 2016, Titan 2021, Candyman, the remake from 2021, and Hatching from 2022, ontological transvaluations are irreversible, and whether endings are read as positive or progressive, or even indeed as factual rather than imagined or dreamed, depends on our teleological expectations as viewers. In some texts, characters may be destroyed by the process of change, but their tragedies take issue with and reject the contexts in which the protagonists exist. Influenced by a postmodern individualistic turn and invested in the idea of destruction of the status quo as arbiter of taste and decorum, most contemporary body horror is fundamentally anti-conservative and anti-establishment. The vocabulary of the subgenre is useful, therefore, in exposing the regulation and disciplining of the body, as well as the processes of surveillance and observation it is subjected to and entangled with. The evolution of body horror's social consciousness has extended its thematic remit and made it more generically impure, which is why it is kind of both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. What was once perceived to be excessive graphicness and extremity has moved into the mainstream, for example, in the explicitness of streaming television that itself has grown more common since the 2010s. In the book that this talk is based on, I cast my net quite wide, considering both the speculative metamorphic fancies of novels like Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch from 2021 and Julia Armfield's Our Wives Under the Sea from 2022 to David Cronenberg's film Crimes of the Future from 2022, as well as those texts where tyrannical or necropolitical power renders the body a mere object or commodity. I also consider the importance of contagion, responsible for reanimating the zombie apocalypse narrative, a trope that speaks to both enduring fears about parasitism and modern anxieties about global pandemics, populism, and the exploitative extraction of labor from the global south. Again, another big topic in contemporary horror. The free flow and immediacy of digital life relies on a technology that has the capacity to alter human life and labor beyond recognition. And these are fears that we're again seeing emerge with the rise of AI. I'm sure AI body horror is already on its way to being made, if not out already. So contemporary body horror also engages with the darker side of transhumanism, and that's also something I explore in the book. I don't have much time to go into that here, but that's been particularly important, especially in video games, I think, of recent years. The legacy of cyberpunk on body horror is evident, but the subgenre is shot through with a contemporary sensibility that is marked by climate change and the data harvesting scandals that have punctuated the 21st century. For example, a greater awareness of online footprints and of what has come to be termed platform capitalism and surveillance capitalism. Both of which are affecting everything from the way we shop to the way we behave. And I think body horror captures a lot of that. So, the body remains a battleground due to the fact that it is intersected by a number of social and legal powers that stand outside the grasp of the individual. Groups and communities whose shared physical or biological traits are subject to prejudice or external scrutiny have turned to body horror in larger numbers because it offers a language through which to combat the disciplining rhetoric that seeks to establish jurisdiction over our freedoms and actions. It is a tragic coincidence that the Roe against Wade ruling, a landmark 1973 case that made abortion legal in the US, was overturned in an equally seismic decision in June 2022, less than 3 months before the premiere of the 5th season of The Handmaid's Tale. Based on the 1985 novel by Margaret Atwood, the series imagines a near-future dystopia in which the wombs of the few fertile women left in the US become the coveted possessions of a refreshed totalitarian patriarchy. So not a million miles off the actual events. The anthology Give Me an A, released in 2022 and directed by 16 female directors in response to the overruling, provides proof that horror is politically engaged and does not take long to process major social changes. It came out the very same year as the ruling. So did, by the way, the anthology Mine, an anthology of body autonomy horror, which was also a direct response to the Roe against Wade ruling. For self-explanatory reasons, many of the film's segments, I'm talking about Give Me an A here, like The Voiceless, a short directed by Megan Swetlow, resort to metaphorical body horror to tell their stories. So in The Voiceless, women's mouths magically become glued shut after news of the ruling spread through social media. Obviously an allegory for the silencing of those women's voices. And so body horror is used in segments like that one as an indictment of a decision taken for ostensibly democratic purposes, but which has the effects of silencing a majority of people and of limiting their bodily autonomy. So body horror is very aggressively political, I think. Feminism has latched on to body horror in order to rethink female bodies and desires in very activist ways as well. Similar engagements with body horror can be observed in text from LGBTQIA+ artists, with trans and non-binary writers in particular, and also a growing number of directors recuperating the subgenre and infusing it with a confrontational power that bolsters representation and speaks to their experience of discrimination and erasure. Most recently, I didn't include it here, but most recently, Jane Schönbrun's I Saw the TV Glow also explores, at least in part, transness in through the language of body horror in a couple of places. Corporeality in such texts is a fluid and fraught space. Its gendered reality and plurality of meanings are reasserted in view of external acts of epistemological violence seeking to contest its reality. And finally, black horror, albeit a broader category that has also found tropes like hauntings particularly fruitful, has returned to body horror for its ability to concretize the complex interactions between the body and the political. Films by directors like Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta explore Black experiences from a thoroughly embodied perspective that takes in its stride systemic inequality and the betrayals of white liberalism. We saw a really good example of that in Get Out. Artists like, indigenous artists like Stephen Graham Jones with the award-winning novel The Only Good Indians from 2020, or Jeff Barnaby, RIP, with the film Blood Quantum from 2019, have been rethinking the horror tradition, telling stories from within communities that once were only portrayed as abject others or as magical or mystical stereotypes. So all of this is changing the nature of horror and therefore also the nature of body horror. In short, and I'm moving towards the conclusion, the rise of body horror cannot be separated from the sea change that the horror genre has undergone in the 21st century. By the mid-2010s, horror had overcome the exploitative prejudice that it had been unfairly accruing over decades of association with skin-deep pulp entertainment. And in fact, people like Anna Bogutskaya now call it one of the main narrative forms in cinema, not just, in genre cinema. Genre fans have, of course, always known better. And modern artists, many of them coming of age during the 1970s and 1980s, are demonstrating that horror can do more than reflect nostalgia for previous decades, that it can rethink tropes and subgenres from the 70s and 80s and that grew popular in different contexts to tell stories concerned with contemporary notions of subjectivity, of control, of liberation, and of transformation. In many of the texts under investigation in this book, the somewhat lone figure of the consumerist individual, typical of the late 20th century, transmutes into more empathetic collectivist entities aware of economic and social privileges, alert to discrimination, and firm in their commitment to meaningful change and to diversity. The growing number of new voices from groups that had previously struggled to gain access to industries long dominated by white, heterosexual, cisgender men has been crucial in driving this transformation, providing original angles and narratives that shake the foundations of the very construction of horror due to their focalization. So, who is scared of what and why? These are creators who know the genre well and are cognizant that its structures still have a lot to offer because their motifs are endlessly malleable and pertinent to present-day audiences who still consume horror for its dissidence and provocation. Like the wider genre, body horror is constantly testing the boundaries of the acceptable. And in this act, reimagining the possibilities of what cinema and fiction can do for us as readers and as viewers, the stories that they can help us tell, the things that we can dream of being and hopefully one day also becoming. Inherent to this process of discovery is the self-awareness awakened by our encounter with the other, which implies an ethical proximity to those inequalities we may not understand or even recognize due to given biases or privileges. Body horror's changes to the body, to personhood, encourage this move towards an enriching other, a becoming otherwise or wiser about the predicament of others. I call it otherwise in the book, but also otherwise, all one word, or different from ourselves. That can make us contemplate the world anew. Opening our eyes to biopolitical structures has benefits beyond promoting a richer, more ethical life. It can help us imagine ourselves according to parameters we may have unconsciously discarded, or which have become normalized to the point of appearing common sense. Body horror constantly asks us to question everything. Who makes the rules? Who benefits from them? What models of humanity and agency are thereby promoted? Who suffers? Who is erased? Part of this questioning leads to an inevitable dread. As one of the collections that I've studied in this book signals, it is worth remembering that despite neoliberal fictions of individuality and personal freedom, your body is not your body. Our bodies always exist and operate within fraught arenas, arenas of what is acceptable, desirable, legal, commendable, and by contrast also of what is abject, discouraged, criminal, reprehensible. These models are still necessarily futurist in Lee Edelman's sense of that word, so based on exponential growth, profit, and the primacy of state, still led by ideologies steeped in the colonial heteropatriarchy. The minoritarian has remained so due to repression from majoritarian forces that have tended towards hegemonic, homogeny, extractive force, and reproduction. Body horror, then, reminds us that our bodies ultimately belong to the states and social and economic structures within which they operate, and that we are not who we think we are, or rather that being who we think we are is not free of ideological biases itself. Crucially, this is my last slide, We are simultaneously capable of thinking beyond current strictures. We can learn, we can change, and we can collectivize. We can grow into morally aware individuals and into communities able to perceive and fight injustices. As body horror makes clear, this sense of transformation is not just advantageous. Change is a fundamental constitutive part of being human, an evolutive inevitability, and an organic principle. Human language, key to many of the processes of agency and subjectivation, also works in this way. It could be argued that body horror's transformative exercises, in their indulgence in what some may see as escapist fantasy, are limited in their impact. Some may ask questions like, is body horror ultimately found wanting against the context of rising sexism, rising homophobia, rising transphobia, rising racism? Is dissidence not still largely met with threats and intimidatory strategies where not downright punishment? Maybe so. But as Paul B. Preciado posits, imagination is a crucial tool in registering the power of relational and transformational thinking. In fact, this philosopher sees it as the only way to overcome the extinction of life, which seems the de facto end of the colonial techno-patriarchy. These are his words. He hopes for a future in which, quote, we will manage to overcome racial epistemology and sexual difference and to invent a new cognitive framework allowing the existence of life's diversity, end quote. Such a task is naturally a tall order for body horror alone, which emerges out of a wider milieu of representation and cultural production. And yet, a revolutionary fervour permeates the subgenre, inviting us to move beyond the here and now. Body horror is an experiment in transitional configurations, of dead ends and new transcendental beginnings, of crossable borders, and, crucially, of future possibilities. Thank you. I'm not quite sure why the presentations have messed up the words for you, but that shouldn't be hiding in the background. This is just a reminder that this text is extracted from Contemporary Body Horror, which should be out hopefully in the next month or so. And something I haven't told you, it will be available to read entirely for free for 2 weeks upon release online. So if you don't want to pay any money for it, that's fine. You don't have to. You can browse it for free for 2 weeks. And I presume you can probably copy paste the text as well if you want to keep it. I don't know. But of course, as I should say for my publisher's sake, if you can, I would really appreciate it if you could order a copy from your university library, because obviously every copy sold helps the publisher and me. So thank you for listening. And those are my email and Twitter handle, X handle, in case you want to get in touch with me or follow me or continue the conversation outside of this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javi, for a thrilling speech. It was fantastic. People are manifesting themselves here on the comments on YouTube, thanking you, saying good words for you. It was fantastic. People loved this presentation, and for sure, we are, eager to read the book Contemporary Body Horror, because all the subjects you brought for us in this lecture, and you said these are elements from the book. It's amazing. It's fantastic. It turns totally the perspective and the view about body horror that we have nowadays. So it's a groundbreaking work. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
I love body horror.
along
So if anybody reading the book ends up loving body horror, that's my job done. I think it's a really important and also very political subgenre.
Oh yes,
so
for
yeah.
sure. I will be one of the first ones to read your book. As well as I am writing my own book about Gothic, and your view, your perspective about body horror, I will incorporate and quote your book on mine, it will be fantastic.
Would you
So,
like me to stop sharing my slides at this point, or should I keep them on?
oh yes, yes, yeah, I can do that for you.
Ah,
Yeah,
fantastic.
better.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone.
So, we still have a few minutes for questions, and along your presentation, okay, the public, our audience, send you some questions, okay, from different parts of your presentation. I will start. I will follow the order, okay, the order from the first to the last. We have until in terms of time, we have something like 20 minutes, okay, for answering questions and comments. And you take your time, okay, for answering them and comment on them if you want, okay. And we do that until here in Brazil, it will be 5:30 p.m. There at UK, it will be 8:30 p.m. At
Time for dinner.
8:30 we end. Okay. So, a first question that was sent to you on your presentation by our audience is this one
Mm.
written by Karini at the very beginning of your speech. Would the picture of Dorian Gray be considered a book in the category of body horror?
Obviously, body horror as a category is a late 20th century coining, but certainly going backwards, sort of using that term retrospectively, so to speak, for sure. In fact, Jack Halberstam in his book Skin Shows writes about Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde as examples of proto body horror. I mean, I don't think he mentions that specifically in the chapter, but you can read between the lines because they are concerned with things like the repressed self, degeneration, which is of course also another aspect that the body horror often turns to. And a film like The Substance that I mentioned that has just come out is essentially a rewrite of Dorian Gray, and also of Jekyll and Hyde. So they definitely share those concerns, even if body horror as a genre category didn't quite exist at the fin de siècle. There are of course other writers that one could think of as engaging with elements of body horror, like the cosmic fear writers, people like Arthur Machen or Blackwood to some degree, Algernon Blackwood, H.P. Lovecraft to some degree, but those with different aspects of body horror, maybe closer to what Kelly Hurley calls the abhuman, than explicitly body horror. But yes, I see Dorian Gray as one manifestation of body horror, certainly as we now consume it and think of it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, here we have another question, okay, from a different part of your presentation. This one here by João Vitor. Professor, you commented on some Japanese body horror works from cinema. Would there be any distinction in the aesthetic and thematic identity of Japanese works when compared to Western productions?
Most definitely. I think, the Japanese aesthetic is definitely marked by, the post-atomic era. I think that's evident in the cyberpunks of the 1980s and what follows. But I think that there are also Japanese manifestations of body horror, sort of, I think it's called um, pink eigu. I'm not entirely sure, but it's like a form of sort of erotica that is kind of crossed with horror that is quite unique to the Japanese context. Junji Ito, for example, would be definitely a Japanese body horror graphic art comic writer that's got a very, very kind of unique style, very Japanese style. But also, you know, he was hugely influenced by a writer like H.P. Lovecraft. So I think, as we see with a lot of contemporary examples, some of them, I mean, I've mentioned films from quite a wide range of countries. It's both a universal language that I think speaks better maybe than other subgenres that might be more culturally specific, but at the same time, they come from very unique backgrounds and unique sensibilities that kind of shape it one way or another. So I'm thinking of a film like Horrors of Malformed Men, which is, you know, a kind of classic of Japanese body horror. In some ways, it's a little bit like Dr. Moreau, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is some people might see as another body horror. But in other respects, it's inherently and uniquely Japanese, you know, even at the level of how the story's told. So yeah, I would say that, you know, that in some respects, the sort of shared elements of body horror work across cultures, but in others, there's a kind of unique Japanese identity coming through those films. I'm sorry to say that I don't know enough about the Japanese cinematic context to be able to speak to those with any degree of authority, but certainly the ones I've seen probably about 10 or 15 of them, would kind of like work along those lines.
So, following the questions, we have this one from Ingrid Santos.
Mm.
Can films that address gender dysphoria, such as I Saw the TV Glow, be considered inherently part of body horror?
That's a great question. I said I hadn't included I Saw the TV Glow in my presentation, and I had. I had anticipated my own ignorance and added it at the end. So yes, I definitely saw. I would say that I Saw the TV Glow is many things. It's one of those, you know, it's a nostalgia film. You know, it's kind of like veiled love for shows like Buffy or The X-Files really comes through, and it's kind of like almost Cronenbergian in its kind of like obsession with television as a medium itself. You know, the bit where the main character almost gets sucked by the television set. So it's not a straightforward body horror, but it definitely uses elements of body horror, especially towards the end. I hope this is not a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it, but there is a scene towards the end where the main character sort of cuts themselves in the middle, opens themselves, and it's like the kind of a TV screen hiding under the skin, which is a way, of course, of saying that for this particular person, television was a constitutive part of their identity. In fact, it's the way that this person communicates with the other main character, you know, mostly through tapes. But of course, we also know that this character is trans, and so it has kind of like a double element of kind of like literally opening up the self, letting out the real true self from underneath, which you see in a lot of queer body horror and also feminist body horror, you know, letting the real person out, sort of breaking the membrane of the body, which is kind of seen as the social part, and then letting the real you out. So I definitely see it as definitely part body horror. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do in the book, sort of suggesting that body horror can also be used as a tool for thinking about films that might not be entirely body horror as such, but that might use elements of body horror.
So following the sequence here, we have another question by João Vitor. What is the biggest difference in formal and content conventions in the manifestation of body horror in electronic games? What would make these works have a specific characteristic of their media?
Again, I don't specifically write about video games, although I do mention a couple of them in the book, because it's almost impossible not to. But obviously, the main difference between video games, especially the kind of stealth games where you might see body horror, things like Scorn or things like BioShock, is of course that they tend to be first-person game, so you are personally invested in this. Or one of my favorites, Dead Space, which I think is one of the most atmospheric video games ever made. The body horror in those texts tends to be a lot more involved and often even more celebratory. So BioShock, you literally need to alter your body in order to be able to advance through the game, and it's actually a source of joy because it gives you superpowers. You kind of, it gets close to the superhero action film in those aspects, where the transformation of the body is almost an enhancement to the character rather than something that's inherently horrific. But stories like Scorn, for example, which is like a nightmare out of Beksinski and H.R. Geiger, can also be quite dark. And again, I will not spoil this one for anyone who wants to play it, but it has a much darker end. So I think that even games that kind of use the whole kind of body as machine, body as enhancement, can end up in pretty dark places. It's kind of what I really enjoy about body horror. You don't always get the same story. They kind of like center around similar narratives and similar narrative arcs, but they sometimes come to very differing conclusions. A lot of video games also are a lot more dystopian, or certainly centered in the future, much more so than films, I think, because that aesthetic again plays into the whole superpowers and abilities that normally we like in horror films. But yeah, things like Dead Space, the body horror can be the other that can, like, infect you, and then you become part of that thing. So it can be more conservative in that respect as well. I hope that answers your question. But again, my knowledge of video games is more limited than my knowledge of cinema and literature.
Well, I think that the next question has something to do with this previous one, Javi. This one by our friend Oscar Nestares. Thank you for such an amazing conference. In your opinion, in terms of subgenres of horror, is there a political counterpart to body horror as a progressive subgenre, a conservative horror subgenre?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think it's always also a matter of perspective. So I absolutely loved The Substance. I thought it was an amazing feminist film, and I thought it used body horror to the best of its abilities to tell a very personal and very horrific story. But of course, not everyone has responded to that film in the same way. Some people have accused it of engaging in precisely the problematic rhetoric that it seeks to criticize. So there's always kind of like a potentially conservative element even within body horror, and I don't want for a moment to suggest that all body horror is, ideologically progressive inherently. But certainly most of the one that I've encountered is at least susceptible of that reading. And I think that a lot of it has to do oftentimes with whether the directors can see an easy way out, or even a sense of hope, or whether they think that there is no hope. And I think that with the body horror that might be called more conservative, sometimes people see that lack of hope as a regressive element, especially because we're so used now to stories giving us happier endings. We like our body horror to be kind of progressive and to help us, to be more speculative, to sort of think us beyond the strictures of the present. But I personally don't think that limits the political potential of a film like The Substance. I think it's wonderfully progressive. Maybe, to answer your question more directly, maybe I see strands of folk horror kind of engaging in potentially more regressive work, in that they tend to, people like Roger Luckhurst have talked about Brexit Gothic or Brexit horror, and talked about some of these folk horrors as engaging in these notions of closed-off communities, which again bring back the idea of insularity and kind of difference, and sort of like the migrant, pushing the migrant out, pushing the foreigner out, which I think is potentially more conservative. But then I know that there have been many books extolling the virtues of folk horror and saying that a lot of it is actually going against those paradigms that it uses. So I think all horror, because it is, inherently about that which we find oppressive and scary, has to indulge to some level with replicating the structures of oppression that it criticizes. Whether it kind of like reifies them or not, I think is more unique to each film. So yeah, I think you could probably name almost any genre and find more subgenre and find any kind of potentially more regressive elements. Maybe torture horror, I would say, is probably one that has been the least ideologically interesting to me. I'm not sure that the Saw films have much more to say really about their context that they haven't already said. And I personally kind of like veered away from those texts because I didn't really find any redeeming qualities in their kind of interest in torture and killing. So maybe torture horror would be the more obvious answer. Not to say that it can't be read progressively as well.
Oscar wrote here while you were answering Brexit horror.
Check it out. It's in Rebecca Duncan's what is it called? The Edinburgh Companion to the Global Gothic. There's a chapter there by Roger Luckhurst on Brexit horror or Brexit Gothic. It's really, really good. Thoroughly recommended.
So we have here a question by one member of our audience that might be interesting for you, Javi. This one here by Maria Luisa. Sorry. If there is a connection between body horror and the rape and revenge subgenre, how are the transformation of the body and mind and trauma dealt with within body horror?
So I think that's two questions, really, isn't it?
Yes,
The relation
yes.
between, yeah. So to speak to the first one, I think the rape and revenge subgenre is its own thing. It has its own history. Alexandra Helen Nicholas has written a fantastic book on rape, revenge, horror films as feminist films. So I'm not just saying that as a man. There are very educated women who are kind of defending rape revenge films as well as progressive. But a very clear example of that connection is, again, the example of Carolee Fargiat, the director of The Substance. Her previous film was Revenge, which is a rape and revenge film. And if I had to trace the kind of areas of similarity between the two, there's also a form of transformation in the rape and revenge subgenre in which the main protagonist normally migrates from victim to either attacker or force of revenge, force of vengeance. And there's sort of like an element of empowerment there to going from kind of passivity to active, shall we say, retribution, that I think, again, sees that transformation from one character to the other. I wouldn't normally consider rape revenge films body horror because to me they lack the other key element of body horror, which is the physical transformation. It's more of a psychological one. But since I'm considering cannibalism as an example of body horror, I guess a case could be made for the rape revenge subgenre too. Again, that's another great example of a subgenre that has been seen as both incredibly progressive and also incredibly regressive in some of its examples. Last House on the Left, famously, or I Spit on Your Grave, both revered as incredibly progressive films and also by other people as incredibly regressive and sexist even. So very much down to the viewer in some respects.
Well, Javi, I think that we have other questions, but we are out of time, right? So I'd like to finish this session with a message that our friend Julio França sent to you on the comments. Okay. Thank you, Javier, for graciously accepting our invitation. It is truly an honor for our group to have you with us today, and I continue to dream of the day we can welcome you to Brazil in person, and I'd like to make Julio's words my own words as well. It will be Amazing to meet you in person here in Brazil, Javier. As soon as you can, we will bring you, okay? We will bring you to
Um,
Brazil.
the plane trip might kill me, but I'll do my best. It
And
would be my great
thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
It will be our pleasure as
Mhm.
well, for sure. So
I
thank
just
you
wanted to
so
say
much.
that I wish you the very best with the rest of the conference, and sorry I can't attend more of it. I'm teaching all of this week, but yeah, I just wanted to wish you and the rest of the conference team and the attendees the very best with the rest of this conference. I hope it continues to be stimulating, and I am very excited for the growth of Gothic studies in Brazil. It seems to me a hugely exciting time to be working in this field.
It is being exciting for us as well. Thank you so much. And I will finish the session in Portuguese as well, okay? And then we finish the transmission. Então, pessoal, essa foi a nossa conferência de abertura. Obrigado pela presença de todos. Logo mais às 18h30, nós temos a nossa primeira mesa redonda do evento, Góticos de Língua Inglesa. Espero vocês lá também. E muito obrigado a todos e a todas que participaram, que mandaram perguntas, que mandaram mensagens. Infelizmente, não há tempo para o professor Xavier responder a todas as perguntas, mas muito, muito, muito obrigado pela participação. Um grande abraço a todos e a todas, e até logo mais.